Part of this memo of understanding has to do with the relaxation of sanctions that have been put in place on Iran for many years now. And I'm curious, at a very granular level, what that means, the logistics of removing those sanctions and what it's going to mean for the Iranian economy if, in fact, that happens.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think it's important to note, obviously, Iran's been under significant sanctions for years. Some of these sanctions, including INARA, actually require congressional notification or verification. So there's a bigger question in terms of what type of sanctions relief can happen. It should be reminded to the viewers that when the JCPOA was enacted and went into effect in 2016, it took 6 months before sanctions relief kicked in. We've been hearing rumors that a general license was actually due to be released yesterday to begin allowing Iran to trade their oil without fear of consequence almost immediately. But a big part of where Iran got the short end of the stick in the JCPOA was global banks wouldn't touch Iran even once secondary sanctions were lifted and European and Asian firms could touch Iran without fear of consequence from the U.S. Hopefully they remember that, but I do think it's important to note that businesses are not clamoring to get back into Iran, and these sanctions are going to take time to be lifted ultimately.
There's also a bit of a sequencing issue here, right? Because in that MOU, there's two things. There's a potential release of funds and there's sanctions relief. Right. But if the funds were to be released before sanctions relief, those funds could only be used in line with the standing sanctions, correct? They would have to be used for humanitarian purposes and fitting within those rules.
That's correct. And there's also no guarantee that their money is good with the type of places they may want to buy humanitarian aid from. That is a bit of the challenge, is Iran is radioactive from not just a sanctions standpoint, but a money laundering standpoint. And obviously the broader state of the regime makes it less desirable. The real question is that those mechanics, you've also got to remember, Iran is a state sponsor of terror, which creates a whole other bunch of sanctions related issues that are lifted in a slightly different way. So this is not as simple as the vice president may say and simply flipping a switch and lifting things. This should be done methodically. I mean, the JCPOA took 20 months to negotiate. We're talking about a 60-day MOU that's already off to a pretty bumpy start.
So, Jen, I hadn't realized that. So there is this, group of sanctions, but you're saying even if they lift those terror, supportive terror DOJ sanctions may not be part of that? They may be a separate issue?
That's correct. So the state sponsor of terror designation is a separate regime that requires a different lifting process. And if you'll note, Syria, for instance, is still deemed a state sponsor of terror, even though we're relatively in good standing between the new Syrian government and the U.S., but they're still deemed an SST. So it's not quite that straightforward for this lifting. There's a lot of unanswered questions going forward. And will Iran comply with the terms of this? That toll-free point was only good in their eyes for 60 days of this MOU, and then they may begin charging tolls again.
Dan, help us understand how you're thinking about the efficacy of sanctions in this environment. So I know that a criticism during the Biden administration, for instance, was too many sanctions have been applied. They're losing their efficacy. They're being used too punitively. In this world in which they are removed more quickly, perhaps, than they were slapped on to begin with, what does that say about the degree to which they work, that they can compel a country to do something or another?
Look, sanctions helped force Iran to the negotiating table in 2015. I do think the efficacy of sanctions has been degraded over time. And if you look at this conflict, sanctions were largely abandoned in favor of kinetic warfare, which the president seems to be wildly supportive of. I mean, the sanctions are a little bit of a complexity here because you can take sanctions off the table. It doesn't mean businesses are going to want to touch a market. And that's a bit of the challenge that Iran needs to balance if they really are eager to re-engage in the global economy. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the top of their agenda. They're kind of a ways off. I think Senator Kennedy said it best. You'd have to be homeschooled by a day drinker to think that Iran can actually do anything here. Meaning, will they comply with the terms of this agreement, like demining the strait? I think there's a lot of pre-steps that have to happen before the sanctions can truly be lifted. But that's the question of what this administration is going to do.
Classic Kennedyism there.
100%.
Yes. His words, not mine.
Yes,
of course. When you look at private sector reticence, even if these sanctions were nominally lifted or some of the sanctions were lifted, what are the big issues? Is it just what you were just talking about, instability and not being confident that the state of play is going to hold? Is it the Iranian currency and its negligible value on the market? Is it all of the above?
I think the simplest way, the plumbing, the economic plumbing isn't there. Are there correspondent banking relationships to allow free trade to occur? And the answer is no. Most global banks will not touch this business, nor do they have any interest in the near term in re-engaging with Iran. We learned this in 2015 with the JCPOA. A number of large European energy, automotive, aviation companies announced deals to re-enter the market, but they actually couldn't make good on those because they couldn't finance anything. They couldn't find a bank to actually move capital around. That's very likely what will end up happening again. The private sector is really not interested in Iran right now.
Funny thing happening now, Dan, we've got Vice President J.D. Vance on Fox News saying we're going to give this negotiation a chance. We're going to go after the enriched uranium stockpile. Then, on the other side of the screen...
And he could be leaving sometime soon.
Yes, all that update. You have Tasnim, one of the semi-official news agencies in Iran, saying the Strait of Hormuz has been closed once again. So I think speaking to what you're talking about here just a moment ago, the lack of clarity, the amount of confusion that all parties, including businesses, face here. And that's where I want to go lastly with you, if I could, Dan. What's it going to take What's it going to take for businesses to become interested in or able to do business in Iran once again? I know that the Russia parallel isn't a great one here, but there was all of this talk, a year into that conflict, that maybe the appetite was changing, and if things were to be relaxed, U.S. companies, global multinationals would be interested in getting into that market once again. What's the threshold, Dan, at which a Western company, would want to do business with Iran again?
I mean, realistically, you're talking major Western companies being out of this market for 50 years. The likelihood of an about face in an environment where, especially in this Trump administration, the geopolitical winds can change so quickly. I know none of my larger clients that are interested in making a decision in an environment where you lack that predictability. I mean, for everything you just mentioned, I mean, we saw 7 vessels transit the Strait on Wednesday, 6 in and 1 out of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, there really is no commerce happening here. That predictability needs to come back, and you need evidence and time to demonstrate that predictability. But I don't see businesses being interested in Iran in the foreseeable future. It's not that ripe a market, and the risks are still too great that you can end up losing out if you attempt to go in, putting capital on the ground.